All right, thanks, Kerry, and thanks everyone for turning up today and giving your time to listen to what we've been up to in the Beacon. You can see that I've shaved since the photo in the bottom left corner. That was supposed to be my COVID beard. When I shaved, COVID was supposed to go away, but that doesn't seem to have worked. So look, I'm going to talk about the second theme, the transitions theme. So I might just go to the next slide now, please, Mel. Thank you. Look, so transitions is a story of both mitigation and adaptation. So that is reducing emissions so we have less climate warming, and also adapting to the inevitable climate warming that's built into the system that Brendan mentioned in the beginning. And we have a really broad spectrum of research around these three core areas of place, focal sectors, and change levers. And to give you a little bit of a sense of scale of theme two, we have in the first year seeded 8 different projects consisting of about 30 individual researchers from 3 of the university's 4 groups. So from the Griffith Business School, from Griffith Sciences, and also from the Health Group. And today I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple of things that are moving relatively quickly and that are on the horizon, I guess, in the next sort of 12 months or so. And that's the 2 in red, some initiatives under item 4, clean energy and transport, and also something that's emerging on the regulatory space. Now, can we have the next slide? Okay, there's a lot going on this slide, so I'll give you a few minutes to sort of digest that. But I think that the fact there's a lot going on this slide is a bit of a metaphor for what's happening in this space. The shift towards and the development of electric aviation is happening at such a rapid pace. I mean, the slide in front of you is slightly over a decade worth of developments from Airbus, who are putting a lot of effort into this space, but they're not, by no means, not the only one. And so one day, probably a lot sooner than you think, you'll be jumping on a plane that's powered by electricity. The amount of development that's going on is simply phenomenal. And to support some of the research and information we need to help, in particular, Australia, or even more narrowly than that, particularly Queensland, to transition to a future where aviation is much lower footprint and is supporting the electric fleet of the future. The Beacon, in collaboration with the Griffith Institute for Tourism, are supporting a Queensland Future Fellowship application to conduct research into the policy settings and also the business case needed to really ramp up the electrification process in Queensland. And the fellow we've put forward is Dr. Emma Whittlesey, who some of you may know. She's one of our adjunct research fellows. And next slide, please. Now. So on that note, Emma has put together a really amazing webinar series, one of which is on this afternoon, actually. It starts at 3 o'clock this afternoon on policy leadership. And in that particular session, you would hear from Ryan Wardman. Ryan is the director of Sounds Air, which is a small plane, or aeroplane company based in Blenheim in the north of New Zealand, South Island, and it's aiming to be the first airline to go completely electric. And it's got 3 19-seater planes due to come on board in 2026. So we're talking about quite soon in terms of that transition. So that's he'll be talking to you in the seminar this afternoon, and then we've got 3 more seminars and subsequent Thursdays after that. They're all free. If you'd like to register, please do so. In the final seminar around transforming our airports, you'll hear from our very own Brisbane Airport Corporation and what they're doing. And what I hadn't realised is Brisbane Airport Corporation actually have a subsidiary of a Dutch company that's committed to making the world's most sustainable airports. So we should see good progress in that space in our own back door in the next few years. Next slide, please, Mel. Now, as an economist, I had to bring up carbon pricing. Right? We all know that the first best policy to reducing emissions is to put a price on carbon. Whether that's done via an emissions trading scheme or a straightforward tax, I'm not convinced it really matters, but we certainly need to have a price on carbon. One of the issues that has always been put forward as a stumbling block to pricing carbon, and certainly it was a discussion we saw in our debates a few years ago, is this issue of carbon leakage and the idea that you make your domestic manufacturers or carbon-intensive industries uncompetitive, and therefore those industries move to locations where they're not facing some kind of carbon price. And traditionally, the response to that has been to either give free permits if it's a trading scheme, or give tax exemptions if you're operating under a carbon tax to those industries. Now, the problem with free permits or tax exemptions is you really dampen the price signal, and really dampen the incentive for those industries to reduce their emissions. So the new policy, the policy that's rapidly emerging, is this idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Quite simply, that's a tariff that countries and regions, and it's been progressed most strongly in the European Union, it's a tariff that regions and countries put on in place to essentially tax imports from countries that do not have carbon prices in place. So, for example, if Australia persists with its current policy settings, you can expect carbon emissions-intensive industries exporting out of Australia to face carbon tariffs in many markets that they try and import to in the years ahead. Could we have the next and final slide, please, Mel? And what this slide shows, and it's a map out of a really good report from the Australia Institute on this idea of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. What this slide illustrates to me is how out of step we are, how isolated we are compared to all of the other countries that we would normally compare ourselves to in terms of carbon pricing. All of those countries highlighted on this map have either a emissions trading scheme or a straightforward carbon tax in place. All of Europe, the European Union, as predictably the Scandinavian countries, Canada by state, some of the states of the United States, and certainly Joe Biden would suggest that there'll be more carbon pricing to come in terms of the broader US picture. This all suggests to me that carbon pricing is coming to Australia, whether we like it or not. The issue we have of not imposing our own carbon price is when we face these carbon border adjustment mechanisms, we effectively pay a carbon tax, but we give it to taxpayers in other countries. We don't collect it internally. So it seems like to be in the worst of all possible spaces. But I think that's about my 7 and so minutes that I was allocated. So thanks for listening. Happy to take questions either at the end of this or offline via email. And I think I'll hand over to my colleague, Professor Susan Harris-River.